Okay, here's a specific question from Lane Bork. Mr. Ferguson, do you feel that's for both of you, do you feel the big cause in the current Middle East conflict lay more in modern times or more in the events of Herodotus's histories or something else?
Well, I think the conflicts of our time have relatively shallow historical roots. Though I wouldn't say, as often people do say, that they can all be blamed on decisions taken between around 1917 and 1921. It's an easy argument to make that the problems of the Middle East...
Your hero, Churchill, didn't get it wrong.
Well, you see, it's easy to blame British and French imperialists for the way in which the Middle East's landscape changed after World War I. But this is to overlook a fundamental problem, which is that the Ottoman Empire was no idyll. Indeed, the first modern genocide happened before the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in 1915, as I'm sure everybody here knows. So one can't simply blame this on decisions taken when the Ottoman Empire was broken up. There was something already badly wrong in that region, just as the process of Jewish colonization that ultimately produced the State of Israel predated the First World War and can be traced right back into the 19th century. And I think I would look there. One has to look, it seems to me, to the mid-19th century and the process that leads up to the First World War and then beyond to understand the problems that we currently face. They do have to do with that phenomenon that interests me so much, ethnic disintegration, when different ethnic and sectarian groups become increasingly hostile to one another to the point of being unable to cohabit peacefully. That's a process which is actually, it seems to me, the most interesting one to understand in modern history. Remember Samuel Huntington, who predicted in 1993 that the post-Cold War era would be about a clash of civilizations. Well, the history of the Middle East suggests otherwise. It suggests actually far more complex processes, particularly of sectarian violence within so-called civilization. And that seems to me to be a really difficult thing to explain. What is it that causes Sunnis and Shias to engage in systematic violence against one another? This is a new phenomenon in the sense that it hasn't been seen much in recent years, but it's an ancient phenomenon because it can cite disputes that go back into deep history. One of the things that makes a question like that so difficult is that the protagonists justify their hatred of one another in terms of the distant past. And that inclines us to think that all of this lies, I don't know, as far back as the early history of Islam. But I don't think it does. I think these are just legitimations of relatively recent disputes between people living cheek by jowl in relatively densely populated, impoverished cities.
I think I would add one thing, which is alluded in your observation, but I think there's something in, let me call it, the Arab culture, North Africa, Middle East, that we have seen these kinds of struggles among families, the Hashemites versus the Sauds and so on, all the different subcultures, and very much, I think, in the spirit of the War of the World, but that have been at each other for quite a long time, not necessarily fighting out ancient enmities and so on, but simply family rivalries, cultural rivalries, and so on for relative dominance. And post-World War I, they kind of got locked into national boundaries, e.g. the Saudi peninsula and the Hashemites up toward Jordan, etc. And we have transposed, I think, cultural, tribal, familial conflict into nationalism, and that becomes extremely difficult because then it's no longer quite as malleable and amenable to the kind of compromises that history actually allowed them to pursue in the past.
The only thing I'd add to that, Peter, is that before we make any blanket claims about the character of Arab culture, or for that matter, Islam, we should remember that although the Middle East hasn't been a peaceful place since World War II, the wars that have been fought there have, with one exception, been very small.
Yes, that's true.
And that exception is the Iran-Iraq War. Most of the wars in the Middle East that we've seen have been short in duration. The casualty rates have been, by mid-20th century standards, tiny. Europe has been, historically, a far more violent place than the Middle East. It's only very recently that our propensity for slaughtering one another within European civilization has finally been tamed. I mean, clash of civilizations.
You did a pretty good job.
Right, but even before then, think of the 30 Years' War. Protestants and Catholics have inflicted more violence on one another over the longue durée than Sunnis and Shias, or for that matter, Arabs and Jews. And one should bear that in mind before passing judgments on the region.